Hi, I'm Jane Smith. I'm the author of the Tommy Bell Bushranger Boy series. Today I'm going to read you the first chapter of this book, Shootout at the Rock. Chapter 1, Breaking the Rules. Right from the start of the school day, things went wrong for Tommy Bell. It began when Mrs. O'Grady handed back their history tests, and Tommy got a big fat 2 out of 10. She frowned at him and said, "Tommy, see me at lunchtime." That was bad news. Mrs. O'Grady was nice, but she was strict. Tommy was dreading lunchtime. "But history's boring," Tommy tried to explain later when Mrs. O'Grady kept him back. The bell had gone for lunch and all his friends were out playing. It was donut day at Tuck Shop, and Tommy had $1 in his pocket for a treat. He was keen to get to Tuck Shop before the donuts sold out. Mrs. O'Grady sighed. She had kind eyes, and Tommy's mum said she was pretty, but Tommy didn't see how someone so old could be pretty. She must be nearly 30. "It's only boring if you're not using your imagination," said Mrs. O'Grady. "You need to imagine what it was like in those old gold rush days. You are going to spend your lunch break reading about a part of Australia's history that I think you'll find interesting." Tommy groaned. His tummy was rumbling for doughnuts, but there was nothing he could do, so he took the book from his teacher's hand. He slumped into a beanbag in the reading corner and huffed loudly. Mrs. O'Grady just smiled and sat at her desk. Tommy looked at the book's cover with another huff. The book was about bushrangers. On the front was a picture of a man on a horse. The horse was rearing up and the man had a gun in his hand. Tommy didn't want to look interested, but he sneaked a peek inside. There were more guns, more men with big hats and big beards and lots of horses. He thought he'd try reading a bit, just to get Mrs. O'Grady off his back. Tommy loved horses. He hoped that one day he'd have a horse of his own, one that he could keep in the big paddock at the back of his home on the outskirts of town. In the meantime, he went to Pony Club where he rode other people's horses. He was becoming a pretty good rider. To his surprise, the time passed quickly, and then Mrs. O'Grady said, "Okay, Tommy, 10 minutes till the end of lunch. You'd better go and eat." Tommy smiled, dropped the book, sprang off the beanbag, and ran to the tuck shop. Too late! All the doughnuts were gone. The tuck shop lady offered him a sandwich, but it just wasn't the same. Stupid history test. Tommy was so upset that he forgot to thank the tuck shop lady. He turned and stomped away. And there was Martin, teacher's pet, sitting on the bench with a doughnut in his hand. Martin was a rich kid who always had money for tuck shop, and it looked like this was his second doughnut. The crumbs of the first were still all over his face. Tommy's mouth watered. "Hey," he said, "can I have your doughnut?" "But," Martin replied, "I've got $1, Tommy begged. "Here, I'll buy it." "No thanks," Martin insisted. He opened his slobbery mouth wide and slowly brought the doughnut up to his lips, and that's when Tommy lost it. He snatched the doughnut right out of Martin's hand. Martin yelled, "Hey, that's mine!" and grabbed Tommy's arm. Tommy kicked him in the shins. Thwack! Martin howled and fell into the dirt. Tommy crammed the doughnut into his mouth. Bliss! Martin was yelling for the teacher, and Tommy tried to tell him to shut up, but his mouth was stuffed so full of doughnut that he couldn't speak. Tommy wasn't going to wait around for Martin to get up and dob him into Mrs. O'Grady. He turned and ran out of the school grounds and down to the park. He knew he couldn't go home just yet. There was a bit of a forest at the back of the park and a nice little creek, so Tommy hung out there all afternoon, making boats out of leaves and floating them down the rapids. When he guessed it was home time, Tommy walked in the door and pretended that nothing was wrong. But his mum and dad were waiting for him, and he knew it wasn't going to be pretty.
"Mrs. O'Grady phoned us,"
Mr. Bell said, and his voice was deadly calm.
"We've been looking for you all afternoon."
Tommy didn't know what to say. "Sorry," he said in the end. Mrs. Bell shook her head sadly. "Tommy," she said, "wagging school is one thing, but stealing and punching poor Martin—" With a shock, Tommy saw that her eyes were red. She had been crying. "I didn't punch him," Tommy interrupted. "I kicked him."
It's violence, Tommy. That's what it is.
His dad said. His eyebrows were so low you could hardly see his eyes.
And you should be ashamed of yourself.
He was ashamed, just a little bit. But the donut was so tasty, and it just wasn't fair that Martin had two and Tommy had none. But Tommy's parents made a big deal of it all and sent him to his room without dinner. That was pretty tough. He was starving all night. That's the end of Chapter 1. Please join me for more of Tommy's adventures in Chapter 2. You can find out more about the books in the Tommy Bell Bushranger Boy series on my website,